The envelope hit the courtroom floor at exactly 9:14 in the morning, and every person inside went silent when photographs of my daughter appeared across the evidence table. My hands went cold, my ears began ringing. I could barely hear the judge asking what had happened. Across the room, Detective Marcus Vale stared at me with a face that had finally lost its confidence. He had spent 3 months telling everyone that my daughter, Emily Carter, was just another case number. He had told me there wasn't enough evidence. He had told my wife Laura that investigations took time. He had told Emily that the people who hurt her couldn't be found because there were no witnesses. But now the photographs were sitting in open court, and the people who had received them were not strangers. They were the same men Emily had identified, the same men the detective claimed he couldn't locate. My daughter sat beside her mother, trembling beneath a gray sweater, staring at the floor because she couldn't bear to look at the screen. I wanted to stand. I wanted to cross that courtroom. I wanted to put my hands around Marcus Vale's throat and make him explain why the most private details of my daughter's case had somehow reached the people accused of hurting her. But I didn't move. I remembered something my father had taught me when I was a boy. Never let the person who wants you angry choose the moment you lose control. So I stayed seated. I watched, and I waited, because Detective Vale had made one enormous mistake. He thought I was simply a wealthy father whose daughter had been failed by the police. He had no idea that my family owned the development company responsible for half the city's commercial district, controlled major municipal contracts, employed thousands of local workers, and had spent decades building relationships with attorneys, auditors, investigators, journalists, and community leaders. People called me Daniel Carter, but around City Hall they knew me as the man who could move a redevelopment project with one phone call. I never considered that power a weapon, until someone decided my daughter's suffering was something they could sell. The courtroom doors opened, and a federal investigator named Sarah Whitmore walked in carrying a sealed box. She looked directly at me, then she looked at Detective Vale. "We found the transaction," she said. Vale's face went white. The prosecutor opened the box and removed a flash drive. The drive contained copies of Emily's medical records, interview transcripts, photographs, private messages, and information that had never been released publicly. Every document had been copied from the detective's case management system. The question was no longer whether someone had betrayed my daughter. The question was who had paid for the betrayal, and how high did the chain of corruption reach. Emily squeezed my wife's hand. I leaned toward her and whispered, "You don't have to fight this alone." She looked at me for the first time that morning. Her eyes were exhausted, but there was something else there. Hope. Then Sarah placed another document on the table. It showed a payment from a private security company to an account connected to Marcus Vale. But the payment was only the beginning, because underneath it was another name, one that would change everything. Deputy Chief Robert Sloan. And Sloan wasn't the person who had ordered the leak. He was only the person who had approved it. 3 months earlier, my daughter Emily had called me at 1:37 in the morning. I remember the exact time because I was awake when the phone rang. Her voice sounded distant, almost disconnected. She told me something terrible had happened and asked me not to come immediately because she was afraid someone would see me. That sentence broke something inside me. Emily was 21. She was studying architecture at a university across town and had always been independent. She rarely asked for help. She had inherited her mother's stubbornness and my habit of trying to solve problems quietly. But that night, she sounded like a child. I drove to her apartment without turning on the radio. The streets were empty. Rain slid across the windshield in long silver lines. By the time I arrived, Laura was already there. She had beaten me by 6 minutes because Emily had called her first. I found my wife sitting beside our daughter, holding her hand. Nobody spoke for several minutes. We eventually contacted authorities, and Detective Marcus Vale was assigned to the case. At first, he seemed professional. He spoke softly. He told us Emily would be treated with dignity. He promised that every lead would be followed. I wanted to believe him. I had no reason not to. My company had dealt with the police department for years, through security contracts and city projects, but I deliberately kept my distance from the investigation. I didn't want anyone claiming my influence had affected the case. Emily needed an investigation, not favors. For several weeks, Vale seemed to be doing his job. Then the delays started. A witness who had initially agreed to cooperate suddenly stopped answering calls. A surveillance video that should have been available was missing. A phone record was supposedly corrupted. One suspect's address turned out to be incorrect even though the same address appeared in 3 separate databases. Every explanation sounded possible individually. Together, they formed a pattern. Emily noticed it before I did. "Dad," she said one evening, "he keeps asking me the same questions." I asked which questions. She said Vale wanted details she had already provided. Names, locations, private conversations. He wanted to know what she remembered about the attackers, what they wore, what they said, where they had been, and what she had told other people. I told her detectives sometimes repeat questions to verify consistency. She nodded, but she didn't look convinced. Then she said something that stayed with me. "It feels like he's trying to learn what I know, not catch them." I should have listened more carefully. Instead, I told her to let the investigation continue. 2 weeks later, one of the suspects somehow knew information that had only been given during Emily's interview. He mentioned a detail she had never shared publicly. When Emily told me, my stomach tightened. "We contacted Vale," he dismissed it. "People talk," he said. "Someone probably leaked it accidentally." I asked whether the interview had been recorded. He said yes. I asked who had access. He listed the investigative team. Then he changed the subject. I started quietly documenting everything. Dates, names, phone calls, delays, missing records. Not because I knew Vale was corrupt, but because something in my instincts had changed. I had spent 30 years building businesses in a city where every transaction left a trail. Numbers rarely lied. People did. And when I compared the dates, I noticed something strange. Every time the investigation appeared to stall, one of the suspects seemed to become more confident. Then one afternoon, Emily received an anonymous message containing a sentence that made her drop her phone. "We know what you told the detective." I stared at the screen. My wife began crying. Emily couldn't speak. That was the moment I stopped treating the situation as a normal investigation. Someone inside the system was feeding information outward, but I still didn't know who. I called an attorney named Michael Reeves the next morning. Michael had represented my family for 15 years and had the rare ability to remain calm when everyone else was losing control. I told him everything. He didn't interrupt. When I finished, he asked one question. "Has your daughter received anything else?" I said no. He told me not to contact the police department directly until we understood what was happening. He recommended bringing in an independent digital forensics firm. We did. The firm discovered that Emily's case information had been accessed far more often than department policy allowed. Her file had been opened late at night, on weekends, and from terminals that belonged to officers who had no legitimate reason to view it. The access logs were incomplete, but enough remained to establish a pattern. One username appeared repeatedly. MVale17, Marcus Vale. I felt anger rising in my chest, but Michael stopped me before I said anything. "Don't confront him." I asked why. "Because if he's involved, confrontation tells him what you know." That was the first moment the situation became a chess game. We didn't accuse anyone, we watched. We requested records through legal channels. We quietly hired former federal investigator Thomas Reed to examine the case from outside the department. Reed was 62, gray-haired, and almost painfully patient. He spent 2 days reviewing documents before telling me, "Your daughter's case has been deliberately fragmented." I asked what that meant. He explained that evidence was being separated across different systems so no single investigator could see the entire picture. A witness statement here, a phone record there. A surveillance request delayed elsewhere. The result was confusion. Confusion created plausible deniability. It was sophisticated enough to suggest planning. Then Reed found something more troubling. A private security company called Meridian Protective Services had been making payments to several city employees. The payments were disguised as consulting fees. One recipient was Marcus Vale, another was Deputy Chief Robert Sloan, a third was an assistant prosecutor named Helen Grant. Meridian was owned by a man named Victor Danner, a wealthy contractor whose company had recently lost a major municipal security bid. Michael recognized the name. Danner had been involved in a dispute with one of my development projects 2 years earlier. He had wanted a contract that my company declined to support because his bid failed an independent compliance review. I remembered him as an aggressive businessman, nothing more. But now his company was paying officials connected to my daughter's investigation. That could have been coincidence. Then Reed found an email. It had been sent from a private account to Marcus Vale. The subject line read, "Carter File." The message contained only one sentence: "We need to know what the family knows." My blood went cold. This wasn't about Emily anymore. Someone was investigating us. The question was why. We searched old corporate records and found a connection between Meridian Protective Services and a property consortium that had been trying to acquire land near the downtown redevelopment district. That land was controlled by my company. If the consortium could force us into a scandal, pressure our investors, or create legal uncertainty around my family, they could weaken our position. But that still didn't explain why Emily's case had become their tool. Then Reed discovered something that made the entire situation darker. One of the suspects in Emily's case had received a payment from a shell company connected to Meridian. Suddenly, the people accused of attacking my daughter were financially connected to the same company paying the detective. The case wasn't simply being mishandled, it was being managed. Someone wanted those suspects protected. Someone wanted Emily discredited. And someone wanted me distracted while a much larger business operation moved forward. Michael looked at me and said, "Daniel, they may have chosen your daughter because they thought her pain would keep you emotional." I stared at the files. He was right. They thought grief made people predictable. They were about to discover the opposite. We built a small investigation team without telling anyone outside the circle. Michael handled legal strategy. Thomas Reed tracked evidence. A cybersecurity specialist, named Nina Patel, examined digital access logs. I stayed away from the police department. That was difficult. Every instinct in me wanted to confront Marcus Vale and demand answers. But we needed the evidence to speak first. Nina discovered that documents from Emily's file had been copied to an external device 3 separate times. The copying occurred after midnight. Each time, the system recorded a temporary security exception authorized by a supervisor. That supervisor was Robert Sloan. We now had 2 names. Vale accessed the file. Sloan authorized the exceptions, but we still needed to establish what happened to the copied information. Reed found that a private email account associated with Victor Danner had received encrypted attachments on the same dates. The encryption made the contents unreadable, but metadata showed the files originated from a department terminal. We requested a court order for the account. Danner's attorneys fought it. That reaction told us more than the account itself. People don't spend enormous legal fees fighting irrelevant information. The judge eventually granted the order. Investigators recovered messages. One message from Danner to Vale said, "The girl cannot know who has the file." Another said, "Make sure the father stays focused on the police." I read those words twice. They were no longer merely corrupt. They were manipulating a family in crisis. I asked Michael whether we could expose them immediately. He said not yet. We need the whole chain, so we waited. That was the hardest part. Emily was still struggling. Every time she heard a police siren, her body tensed. Every time her phone vibrated, she looked afraid. Laura barely slept. I began working from home because I didn't trust the company's offices. Rumors had started circulating that I was under investigation for financial misconduct. Someone had leaked a fabricated report to a business blog claiming my company had violated city procurement rules. The timing was too perfect. While I was trying to protect my daughter, someone was attacking my reputation. The plan was becoming obvious. Discredit the father, discredit the daughter, discredit the investigation, then force the family into silence. But they had made another mistake. They underestimated how many people knew my family outside the police department. My company's board chairman, Evelyn Brooks, immediately ordered an independent audit. Our auditors found no misconduct. Our attorneys demanded corrections from the blog. The story collapsed within 48 hours. Meanwhile, Nina recovered deleted messages from Vale's department workstation. One contained a list of names. Emily's name was at the top. Mine was second. The third name was someone I didn't recognize. Councilman Peter Rowe. Rowe chaired the city's public safety committee. He had also supported Meridian's failed contract. We traced communications between Rowe and Danner. There were dozens. Meetings, calls, property discussions, campaign donations. Nothing illegal by itself, but the pattern was undeniable. Then Nina found a calendar entry titled Carter Problem. The meeting included Vale, Sloan, Danner, and Rowe. The date was 2 days after Emily's case was opened. I stared at the screen. They had planned something from the beginning, but what exactly? Reed discovered the answer in a property filing. Meridian's partners were preparing to challenge my company's ownership of several downtown parcels. Their legal claim depended on proving our company had obtained favorable city treatment through improper influence. They needed a scandal. They needed leverage. And my daughter's case was being used to create it. The police corruption wasn't the entire operation. It was one piece of a coordinated campaign involving money, politics, private security, and personal intimidation. I asked Reed what they were planning next. He said, "Whatever it is, they're moving faster now." That night, Emily received another message. This time it contained only a photograph of our house, taken from across the street. Underneath it were 5 words. "Stop looking, Mr. Carter." My wife saw the message. She looked at me. "What are we going to do?" I looked at the photograph for a long moment. Then I said, "We're going to stop looking quietly." The next morning, I walked into City Hall for the first time since Emily's case began. People stared. Some whispered. Others stepped aside. I didn't care. I wasn't there to threaten anyone. I was there to request a public records review through the proper legal channels. Councilman Peter Rowe tried to stop me in the hallway. He smiled as though we were old friends. "Daniel, I'm sorry about what your family is going through." I looked at him. "Then cooperate with the investigation." His smile disappeared. "I don't know what you're implying." "Good," I said. "Then you have nothing to worry about." I walked away. Later that afternoon, Michael received a call from the State Attorney General's office. They had reviewed the evidence we submitted and opened an independent investigation into corruption within the department. Sarah Whitmore was assigned as special prosecutor. She had a reputation for following evidence wherever it led. She immediately subpoenaed Vale, Sloan, and Danner. The subpoenas triggered panic. Vale attempted to resign. Sloan claimed illness. Danner's attorneys filed emergency motions. Rowe held a press conference accusing me of using my wealth to control the city. That accusation spread quickly. News outlets repeated it. Social media exploded. For 48 hours, the story became about me instead of Emily. Then Sarah released one document, a financial ledger showing payments from Danner's company to Vale, Sloan, and Rowe. The story changed instantly. The public wanted answers. Reporters began examining the contracts. Former employees came forward. One said Danner had been trying to obtain confidential city information for months. Another said Vale had been receiving payments long before Emily's case existed. The investigation expanded. And then came the breakthrough. A former department technician named Carla Mendez contacted Sarah. Carla had been responsible for maintaining evidence systems. She had noticed that certain case files were being copied and then deleted from local terminals. She had reported the issue to Sloan. Sloan told her to ignore it. Carla had saved a backup of the relevant system logs before leaving the department. Those logs showed exactly what had happened to Emily's case. The files had been copied to a device registered to Vale. From Vale's device, they were transferred to a laptop used by Meridian. From Meridian, they were sent to an encrypted server controlled by Danner. We now had the chain. But Sarah wanted more. She wanted proof that the attackers themselves had received the information. That evidence came from an unexpected source. One of the suspects, a man named Tyler Brooks, contacted an attorney and offered to cooperate. He admitted that someone connected to Meridian had paid him to keep Emily's name out of the investigation. He said he had been shown details from her interview to convince him that the police knew what happened. That detail was devastating. It confirmed that private information had been deliberately sold. But Tyler also revealed something else. He said Danner's people had warned him that if he talked, the Carter family would be destroyed. Sarah asked who had made the threat. Tyler gave her a name, Marcus Vale. That testimony changed the case from corruption to criminal conspiracy. Emily heard the news from her mother. She didn't celebrate, she simply sat quietly. When I asked what she felt, she said, "I feel tired." That answer hurt more than anger would have. She didn't want revenge, she wanted her life back. I promised her we would keep going until the truth was public, and the people responsible were held accountable. Then Sarah called me. Her voice was serious. "Daniel, we found the person above Danner." I asked who. She paused. The mayor's chief of staff. I stared at the wall. The corruption reached farther than we had imagined, and suddenly I understood why everyone had been so confident. They weren't protecting one detective, they were protecting a network. The chief of staff was named Richard Hale. He had worked in city government for 17 years and was widely considered untouchable. He had no direct connection to the police department on paper. But financial records showed that Hale's brother owned a consulting company receiving large payments from Danner. Those payments began 6 months before Emily's case. Sarah subpoenaed the company. Hale immediately hired one of the most powerful law firms in the state. The message was clear: he intended to fight. We didn't respond publicly. We let the investigators work. They found emails between Hale and Danner discussing city property acquisitions. One email referred to the Carter problem. Another discussed using the police situation to create pressure. That was enough to establish intent. But there was still a missing piece. Who had actually ordered the detective to sell the case file? Vale claimed Danner pressured him. Danner claimed Hale pressured him. Hale claimed he knew nothing. The investigators needed a direct connection. They got one from Deputy Chief Sloan. Facing multiple charges, Sloan agreed to cooperate. He admitted that Hale had arranged meetings between Danner and senior police officials. He admitted that Vale had been instructed to provide information from Emily's case. He admitted that the goal was to intimidate me and create leverage against my company. But Sloan also revealed something even worse. The attackers had not been the original target. Emily had been chosen because she was vulnerable and because her case could be manipulated without immediately exposing the larger scheme. Sloan described a meeting where Vale said, "If the daughter breaks, the father becomes easier to control." I had to leave the room when Sarah told me that. I walked outside and stood beneath a street lamp in the cold. I felt anger moving through me like electricity. Not because they had attacked me. Because they had calculated my daughter's suffering as a business strategy. Emily had been a person to us. To them, she had been leverage. I called my wife. She answered immediately. I told her the investigation had uncovered the truth. She asked whether Emily knew. I said yes. Laura was quiet for several seconds. Then she said, "Don't let them turn her into the reason we lose ourselves." I knew exactly what she meant. We couldn't let their cruelty dictate our future. The trial began months later. Vale, Sloan, Danner, and Hale faced different charges. Rowe eventually resigned after investigators uncovered undisclosed financial relationships. The city opened a broader review of police corruption. Several officers were dismissed. The department created independent oversight for sensitive cases. Emily's case was transferred to a separate investigative unit. New evidence was reviewed. Witnesses were interviewed again. The people responsible for attacking her were finally prosecuted based on evidence that had been suppressed or manipulated. For Emily, justice was not a dramatic courtroom victory. It was being believed. It was hearing a prosecutor say, "We know what happened." It was knowing that the people who had once treated her pain as information to sell could no longer control the narrative. The first day she walked into court to testify, I stood outside the building with her. She was nervous. Her hands shook. I asked if she wanted to leave. She shook her head. "No," she said, "I want them to hear me." So we went inside. Emily testified calmly. She didn't describe every detail. She didn't have to. She explained what happened, how the investigation failed, and how the leaked information made her feel unsafe all over again. At one point, she looked directly at Vale. He looked away. When she finished, there was silence. Then the prosecutor asked whether she wanted to say anything else. Emily took a breath. "I want my life back." That sentence became the most powerful moment of the entire trial. Not revenge, not hatred, life. The verdicts came one by one. Marcus Vale was convicted on corruption, conspiracy, unlawful disclosure of protected information, and obstruction charges. Robert Sloan accepted a plea agreement and testified against the others. Victor Danner was convicted of conspiracy, bribery, and related financial crimes. Richard Hale was convicted after investigators proved he had coordinated the scheme through intermediaries. Peter Rowe avoided some charges by cooperating with investigators, but his political career was finished. The city government underwent a complete review of procurement procedures. Several contracts were canceled. Independent oversight was expanded. The police department created a new system preventing unauthorized access to sensitive victim files. Those changes mattered, but they could never erase what Emily had endured. After the final hearing, we returned home. Emily sat on the back porch with Laura. I watched them through the kitchen window. My daughter looked different, not broken, not untouched. Different, stronger in a way that didn't come from forgetting. It came from surviving. She had once believed the system would protect her automatically. Then she learned systems are made of people, and people can fail. But she also learned that failure doesn't have to be the final chapter. I walked outside and sat beside her. She asked me whether I was satisfied with the verdict. I thought about it. I'm satisfied they were held accountable. She nodded. That's different from revenge. Very different. She looked at me. Did you ever want revenge? I didn't lie. Yes. She smiled faintly. I knew it. I told her there were nights when anger felt like the only thing keeping me moving. But I also told her that every decision had to be about protecting her, not satisfying me. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you for remembering that." That sentence meant more to me than every verdict, because throughout the investigation, there had been a temptation to turn my power into retaliation. I could have made phone calls. I could have pressured officials. I could have used my company's influence to make people's lives miserable. Instead, I used it to demand independent oversight, preserve evidence, hire experts, and protect witnesses. Wealth had opened doors, but wealth alone hadn't won the case. Evidence had, courage had, persistence had, Emily had, my wife had, the investigators had, even the people inside the system who finally chose to speak had. Months later, I received a letter from the new police chief, Angela Morris. She wrote that the department had reviewed the case and wanted to acknowledge the failures publicly. She apologized to Emily on behalf of the department. Emily read the letter and said, "I appreciate it." She didn't say she forgave them. She didn't have to. Forgiveness wasn't part of the legal process. Healing wasn't something the government could order. It belonged to her. Our family focused on rebuilding normal life. Emily returned to university. She completed her architecture degree. Laura started sleeping through the night again. I returned to my company. The city redevelopment project continued. The downtown buildings eventually opened. People walked through the streets without knowing what had happened behind the scenes. Sometimes I passed the police headquarters and remembered the first night I realized someone inside that building had betrayed my daughter. The building looked ordinary. That was the strange thing about corruption. It rarely looks dramatic from the outside. It hides behind desks, signatures, passwords, emails, invoices, and meetings. It survives because people assume institutions are automatically honest. The lesson I learned wasn't that the system was useless. It was that systems need accountability. A detective can wear a badge and still betray someone. A businessman can wear a suit and still manipulate a victim. A politician can give speeches about public safety while secretly profiting from corruption. But ordinary people can also choose differently. Sarah chose differently. Thomas chose differently. Carla chose differently. Sergeant Bennett chose differently. And my daughter chose differently when she walked into that courtroom and told the truth. 1 year after the trial, Emily asked me to drive her downtown. She wanted to show me the architectural project she had been working on. We parked near the river and walked through a renovated district that my company had helped develop. Glass buildings reflected the afternoon sun. Families walked along the sidewalks. Street musicians played near the fountain. It looked peaceful. Emily stopped beside a public art installation and said, "You know what I used to think when I came here?" I asked what. That everyone was watching me. I waited. Now I realize most people are just living their own lives. She smiled. That was when I understood that healing isn't about pretending nothing happened. It's about making what happened smaller than the life that follows. The corruption case had consumed months of our lives, but it didn't get to consume the rest. Emily graduated. Laura started teaching community art classes. I established a foundation supporting victims who needed independent legal assistance. Not because I wanted my name on a building, but because I had learned how difficult it was for ordinary families to challenge powerful institutions. The foundation funded legal consultations, digital evidence preservation, and counseling resources. We never used it to interfere with investigations. We used it to make sure people had someone who could explain their rights and help them document what happened. Sometimes people asked me why I didn't simply use my wealth to make sure the corrupt officials suffered more. My answer was always the same. Because that would have made the story about me. It was never supposed to be about me. It was about Emily. She deserved to have her voice heard without her father's wealth becoming the headline. She deserved justice without becoming someone's political weapon. She deserved a future that belonged to her. The case eventually became a training example for investigators across the state. They studied how the file had been accessed, how the information had been transferred, how financial corruption had influenced police decisions, and how independent oversight had finally exposed the network. I attended one training session anonymously. I sat in the back and listened to instructors explain the mistakes. At one point, the instructor said, "The most dangerous assumption in an investigation is that nobody will look closely." I almost smiled. That assumption had destroyed the corrupt network. They thought nobody would inspect the access logs. They thought nobody would compare timestamps. They thought nobody would examine payments. They thought a wealthy father would either use influence recklessly or become too emotional to act. Instead, we documented everything. That's what brought them down. Not a dramatic confrontation, not violence, not revenge. Documentation, patience, witnesses, courts, evidence. The truth moved slowly, but it moved, and when it finally reached the courtroom, it was stronger than every lie they had built. Emily still has difficult days. I don't pretend otherwise. Some memories don't disappear simply because a verdict is announced. But she also has good days. She designs buildings. She travels. She laughs with friends. She argues with her mother about paint colors. She calls me when she needs advice and sometimes when she doesn't. That ordinary connection is the greatest victory of all. The people who betrayed her wanted her to become afraid. They wanted her father distracted. They wanted our family divided. They failed. We became closer. They wanted the case to disappear. It became a public record. They wanted their corruption hidden. It became evidence. They wanted me to react emotionally. I learned restraint. They thought they owned the city because they controlled pieces of its machinery. They were wrong. No person owns a city. A city belongs to the people who live in it, build it, protect it, teach in it, raise families in it, and demand accountability when someone abuses power. My family happened to have influence. But influence wasn't the point. The point was that no amount of influence should be necessary for a victim to receive justice. That's why we kept fighting after the trial. That's why we pushed for reforms. That's why Emily's story became bigger than our family. Today, when I think about the night Emily called me, I remember the sound of her voice more than anything else. Fear can change the sound of a person's voice. It becomes quieter, slower, almost distant. I remember driving through the rain. I remember seeing Laura beside her. I remember the first promise I made, that she would never face it alone. I didn't know then that the person assigned to help would become part of the problem. I didn't know her private information would be sold. I didn't know wealthy businessmen and city officials would try to turn her suffering into leverage. I didn't know how far the corruption would reach. But I learned something that night that I will never forget. You cannot always choose what happens to your family, but you can choose how you respond. We could have allowed anger to destroy us. We could have turned the investigation into a personal war. We could have given the corrupt people exactly what they wanted. Instead, we built a case. We found witnesses. We preserved records. We went through the courts. We exposed the money. We let the truth become bigger than the people trying to bury it. And in the end, the detective who sold my daughter's case file lost his badge. The businessman who purchased it lost his company and his freedom. The officials who protected the scheme lost their positions. The political network collapsed. The police department changed. And my daughter kept moving forward. That's the part I want people to remember. Justice isn't always dramatic. Sometimes justice is a young woman returning to school. Sometimes it's a mother sleeping peacefully again. Sometimes it's a father sitting on a porch with his daughter and realizing that the people who tried to destroy her no longer control a single day of her future. If you ever find yourself facing a powerful institution, remember that power is not invincibility. Records matter, witnesses matter, attorneys matter, independent investigators matter, and most of all, persistence matters. The corrupt detective thought he had sold information that would frighten my daughter into silence. Instead, the transaction became the first link in the chain that exposed him. He thought my wealth made me dangerous. He didn't understand that I was most dangerous to his scheme when I refused to become reckless. He thought owning influence meant I would abuse it. Instead, I used every legitimate resource available to make sure the evidence could not disappear. He thought he knew my family. He knew nothing about us. He didn't know my wife would stand beside our daughter through every hearing. He didn't know Emily would eventually walk into court and speak for herself. He didn't know investigators would recover deleted records. He didn't know witnesses would come forward. And he certainly didn't know that the family he was trying to manipulate had spent decades building relationships with people who valued accountability more than money. The city I supposedly owned was never really mine. It belonged to millions of people. But for a brief period, a small group of corrupt officials acted as though they owned the truth. They were wrong. Truth doesn't belong to whoever controls the file. It belongs to whoever can prove what happened, and sometimes, all it takes is one person refusing to accept a convenient lie. For our family, that person was Emily. She refused to disappear. She refused to let someone else's corruption define her. She refused to become only the victim of a crime. She became the person who survived it, confronted the system that failed her, and kept living. That is the ending I wanted, not revenge, not destruction. A future where Emily designs buildings. A future where Laura laughs again. A future where I can answer the phone without wondering whether my daughter's world has collapsed. And a future where the people who abuse their positions understand one simple truth. Authority without accountability is not power. It is a liability waiting to be exposed. Where are you watching from? Comment your city or country below. What kind of story do you want next? Military revenge, psychological thriller, or emotional family justice? And here's the question I want you to debate honestly. If you were in my shoes, after discovering that a detective had sold your daughter's private case file to the very people accused of hurting her, would you have waited for the legal system to expose him, or would your anger have pushed you toward taking justice into your own hands? Think carefully. Because revenge can feel satisfying for a moment, but justice has the power to change what happens after the story ends. Thank you for listening. Take care of the people you love, stay strong when the truth is difficult, and remember that sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one who refuses to lose control. I'll see you in the next story.
टोक्यो क्या कर रही हो?
अभी देखो डिस्प्ले कोड आएगा अभी याद है पहले सेल चेक करना है भाई अब यहाँ पे दिखा है डिस्प्ले कोड डिस्प्ले सेल तो चेक करना पड़ेगा
टोक्यो टोक्यो
स्पेशली वो कितना स्ट्रीम वीडियो लगा दे ये सेम एसडी में भी लगा रहे हो कब लगा
टोक्यो
पहले 30 मिनट वो वीडियो पहले सही था हाँ बंद हो जाता बार बार 10 मिनट बाद 20 मिनट बाद ऑटोमेटिकली बंद हो रहा है बार ये रिमूव हो रहा नहीं अब तो बोर्ड चेंज हो गया था इसका यार
टोक्यो
वो सेट तो चेक